So I'm going to start by telling you all a thing that is important to me. And what I need is for you not to clap, because I'm nervous about it, and too much affirmation would only make me more awkward. And here's the thing. When I was on sabbatical, I wrote a book about human nature, kind of about human nature. It's about how people aren't generally the bright, beautiful packets of optimism that the liberal church so often teaches we are. And it's also about history, and about how history is really a matter of lurches and fits and starts and backwards and forwards, and not this endless parade of onward and upward forever that our forebears have been teaching about for hundreds of years. It's about human nature and history and brokenness and tragedy, and I cannot tell at this juncture, when the publication date is about a month away, if it's really important or really boring, and I'm afraid it might be both, but there it is. And in the middle of my sabbatical time, when I was hunkered down working on that project, the other thing that I did to contribute to my ministry, to our ministry together, is I spent a week in community organizing training with an organization that I'm actually one of the national leaders of, the Industrial Areas Foundation. It was founded by Saul Alinsky back in the day, you know. So I spent a week of training with those folks. And one of the keystone learnings of that training is what's ultimately sort of like a college debate tournament that they do every single year with every new crop of new trainees. What they do is they give you a scenario. In our case, a historic scenario, and every single leader in the room, in our case mostly clergy from around the country, is assigned a side of the story to represent. You don't get to pick, you'll get flip-flopped eventually, but you have to make a case on the side of the story you're given. The organizers, having done this exercise dozens of times themselves, they watch on the outside of the circle to see if you can make a deal, to see if you can make a difference, to see if you can bend the arc toward justice in some way, or if it all just plays out hopelessly again and again and again. Now, in my case, the story we were given is an old chestnut of a story from the classical world. Some of you will be familiar with this. It was a dialogue from the Peloponnesian War, of all things. See, I warned you, it might be important and boring at the same time. Just stay with me. A dialogue famously from the Peloponnesian War between the Athenian Empire, which was stretching its footprint across the ancient Mediterranean, and the denizens of this tiny little island called Milos. The Melians held out. They refused to join the Athenian League, even at the risk of their own annihilation. They held to their ideals. They believed it was enough to be on the side of the angels and that they did not have to compromise with power. And I won't go too far into the whole thing. There is probably a Cliff's Notes version out there. The headline is that the Melians represent political idealism and ideological uncompromising purity. And the Athenians represent political realism, that you have to play the game if you're going to survive it. In the end, in real life, the Melians refused to compromise, and the total and complete annihilation of the island of Milos at the hand of the Athenian Empire is to this day famous in history as one of the worst atrocities ever committed by a supposedly benevolent society. It is also one of history's most famous assertions of the rights that have always been and will always be claimed by those with unbridled and unchecked power. And now I knew all this. I knew the end of the story. I knew that this test was really about idealism versus realism. I knew that the goal should be to not get annihilated. I knew all of that. And yet when it was my turn to debate on the side of the Melians, on the side with everything to lose, when it was my turn to try to survive in the face of power, I gave them not a strategy, but a sermon. Are you surprised? Seriously, and I am not making this up, impromptu, off the top of my head, I stared down the representatives of the mightiest empire known then in the history of the earth, and I said something very much like this: "You may have weaponry and advanced systems which we could never believe or compel or create, but we have poets. We have poets," we said, "and our poets will write of you, and your legacy will be one of dominion, and generations to come will know your name as the oppressors of we, the people of Milos. So kill us if you will, but our poets will write of you." Whereupon, my colleague, Rabbi Michael, who was sitting across from me representing, as he was asked to do, the will and the power of the Athenian Empire, he looked at me and he said, "Yeah, that's nice, but we killed all your poets." He said, "We killed all your poets. You ready to make a deal yet?" And in that moment, in those awkward seconds of total silence when I realized I had been defeated, was the true learning for me in that whole training. It was a tonic for the kind of high vaunted rhetoric that changes nothing. And the fact is that my friend Rabbi Michael Holtzman, he wasn't being mean to me. He wasn't beating up on me. He was reminding me about the world we actually live in. The world as it is, where for the most part power counts more than poetry. And if you're going to live through the day, you need to reckon with it. He was reminding me that being human requires us to deal with power instead of ignoring it, and that the terms of our humanity, the measure of our worth, has everything to do with how society sees us and what measure of power we are afforded in these days that are given to us. And the whole scenario, it begged the question, a question that I put before you today, that I put possibly in both important and boring ways before our whole liberal religious system in my book. Who are we human beings in the face of the mighty systems at work all around us? Who are we in the eyes of power and dominion? You see, systems in general, even though we human beings create them, systems in general do not tend to acknowledge the full and complex humanity of each and every individual. That is not their bag. They don't do that. The systems we create generally perceive people as units of whatever the predominant currency of that system is. In that exercise with the Athenians, I was appealing to the inner poetry of every soul, to the innate value of an honest word, to the fire of the spirit that burns within every being. But I was doing it up against a system that simply did not deal in those currencies and did not care when I tried. In the case of the Athenians and the Melians, the system was an empire in expansion, and its currency was power. And so human beings, no matter how poetic, how grand, and how verbose, they were reduced to instruments of that power or instruments of resistance to that power. In this system, you are with the empire or you are against it. There is no room for poetry there, no room for the refinement and complexity of the human spirit. A person was a unit enthralled to dominant power, and each person moved with that power or was crushed by it. And while the Athenians are long buried, and the fires of Milos stopped burning a couple thousand years ago, we still ask the question, what are we as human beings in relationship to the systems of our day? After all, while many things are different, we are not by any means done with reducing human beings to cogs in a greater wheel. Where once expanding empires used human beings as units of conquest, today our social contract reduces us as human beings to other metrics, other measurables, other things that can be placed and put on a spreadsheet. Today, so often in the systems around us, being human is equated with being a consumer, a user of economic goods and services. a contributor to a larger schema of exchange in which every single soul, yes, all of us, is measured by the contribution we make to an economic system all around us. This is, in fact, the foundation of modern economic theory. The transformation of an individual and complex human person into an economic unit. As John Stuart Mill put it, political economy doesn't treat us as whole people. Rather, it is concerned with each of us as solely a being who desires to possess wealth. In ye olden days of the Peloponnesian War, people were reduced to units of power. Today, people are reduced to units of exchange. And if I am being honest, which I'm trying to do, this capitalist tendency to treat people first and foremost as consumers, it has its advantages, doesn't it? Including the fact that it generally produces greater wealth for a greater number of people. It builds more robust economic systems that in general do really push back at the edges of poverty. Democracy, Churchill said, is the worst form of government, except for all those others that we have tried from time to time. And a similar argument could be made for capitalism. It is the worst way to organize a society like ours, except for all the other ways that we keep messing up. There are policy questions here. There are debates and counter-debates, issues of control and of management, serious conversations about how unbridled the capitalist spirit in our culture should be. And I am not going to go into them today. I am just not, because you don't need me for that. But whatever you think about the systems in which we operate, systems of power, systems of exchange. On a spiritual level, the problem comes not when the system around us seeks to define us in narrow ways, but when we actually believe it. On a spiritual level, the problem comes when we can no longer see ourselves as more than the sum of our parts or the total of our measurable contributions. Because the deep spiritual truth is that we cannot live if we are complicit in reducing ourselves to merely useful metrics. And we cannot thrive if we ourselves believe that we are nothing but getters and achievers and spenders and receivers and doers of all the things on every list. Eventually, the poetry leaches out of our lives, and we find that we are just as desolate, just as weary, just as at risk as if we had never gotten or spent a single thing in the first place. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers, said Wordsworth. And in doing so, we lose touch not only with who we are, but with what might actually make us happy. We are drained of our ability to shift the system around us because we allow ourselves to fall victim to a sense that the system does not include us and is not accountable to us in any way. And beneath it all, this perceived powerlessness to shift the system or even define ourselves within it, our beautiful and complex natures, beneath it all, there is this desolation that is ever so difficult to shake when we allow ourselves to be defined entirely by the powers and the systems around us. You know, somebody once famously asked Howard Hughes, that famous billionaire, how much money it would take for him finally to be truly happy. And do you know what he reportedly said? Just a little more. Perpetually and always just a little more. Until, in time, a little more money, a little more power, a little more success, a little more of whatever unit of exchange you are currently exchanging compounds itself and shows it to be an ephemeral shadow of a thing. And so what are we if we are not merely units of exchange? What are we if we seek to define ourselves? What are we if we don't let the systems around us tell us who we are? To pull right up from Unitarian Universalist theology, we human beings are indeed complex creatures. You know, the Universalists used to be called the no-hellers. That was the sort of nickname that we all sort of felt bad about 100 years ago. They were the people who didn't believe in hell, and by extension, many of them, our theological ancestors, were people who questioned the whole idea that anybody could be born inherently evil in the first place. To our theological ancestors, human beings were not born either inherently innocent or inherently guilty, neither good nor evil, but inherently capable of choice. To put it simply, our theological heritage teaches us that human beings are pure and nearly unfettered potential, which is a beautiful and terrifying thing if you really think about it. We are possibility itself, given form and shape. We are the choosers who shape the systems around us. And so the defining characteristic of what it is to be human in our theological tradition is not our usefulness to some grand design that is so much larger than ourselves we have no choice but to submit. Rather, it is our ability to shift that grand design even just a little bit from the world as it is with its currency of power toward the world as it should be. A world where somebody cares enough about the poets and the prophets to not kill them all for once. We are pure possibility. We are choosers. We are the ones who build the systems and shape them and sometimes topple them. We are more than the sum of our parts, and some might say in our own flawed and finite way, each and every one of us is a miracle. C.S. Lewis once said that there are no ordinary people. You have never met, he said, a mere mortal. Indeed, every single one of us, all 7.5 billion or so, every single one of us is a complex morass of love songs and declarations, of power struggles and deep yearnings, of love and fear, and above all, possibility. Human nature is not only more than inherently good or inherently bad, broken or blessed, it is also more than the units we try to reduce each other to. You are more than the sum of every part, and so am I, and so is every single person you pass. Your possibility and beauty and failure and hope, all wrapped up and presented to the world, ready to shape it into everything you dream it could be. You are the poetry that survives the fires of empire, the love that is bigger than exchange, the intentional power that works within the system so that you, yes, you can change it. You are no mere mortal, no unit of exchange, but a force of nature in and of yourself, always more than every sum of you the world might tally up. May it be so, and amen.